Hello explorers, thanks for joining us again and welcome back to another exciting and informative video on our YouTube channel. If you are joining us for the first time, we want to thank you for watching. In this episode, I will be diving into the reason why Eritrea's growing ties with China and Russia highlights America's inadequate approach in East Africa. In this episode as well, I will be looking at very important specifics here. Dive into geopolitics. I'm going to be covering a long and deepening relationship within China and also Russia and Eritrea. I shall look into Russia's recent engagement in the region. More importantly, I will look at the implications for the United States of America. I shall be closing this episode as the reason why the American response is mute and why this is happening in the region. If you are new to this channel, I will encourage you to watch this video to the end because we have enough to cover. So without any more delay, let's just dive straight into it. China and Russia have recently increased their engagement with Eritrea, a small but strategic located country in East Africa. Meanwhile, American influence in the region is amid a year-long slide. Despite the obvious risk, the United States of America has failed to muster a committed response and has even taken some counterproductive measures that demonstrate a lack of strategic thinking. If those trends continue, a vital region may fall under the conclusive influence of Washington's primary geopolitical competitors in the regional Africa. If you look at the long and standing dependent relationship with regards to China, Eritrea and also Russia. Recently, Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki recently made a 4-day state visit to China, where he was feted with a red carpet and also 21-gun salute. This warm reception reflects his long-standing relationship with Beijing, which predates Eritrea's independence from Ethiopia. In 1967, Afwerki and others from what was then North Ethiopian traveled to China for military training. Almost 30 years later, the same group will lead the emergency and also insurgency that won Eritrea's independence. Afwerki is reportedly a devotee of Mao Zedong and admired the Chinese Communist Party. He has visited Beijing 5 times since 1994 and shares China's goal of rerouting the global orders away from the United States of America and the West. If you look at the geopolitics in play, the Eritrean government's Chinese policy reflects Afwerki's sympathy. The ruling People's Front for Democracy and Justice, known as the PFDJ, started participating in exchanges with the CCP years ago, and Eritrean dignitaries regularly visit Beijing. 3 senior officials, Foreign Ministers Osman Saleh, head of the PFDJ's Economic and also Affairs Hagos Gabrevich, and Presidential Advisor Yamane Gabrevich, account for at least 15 total visits to China since 2010. The Sino-Eritrean relationship even survived the revelations that China sold weapons to both sides of Eritrean and Ethiopian vicious border war during the 1998 to 2000. Beijing's reciprocate Asmara's enthusiasm since Eritrea's independence. 4 of 5 Chinese foreign ministers, excluding the newly emplaced current minister, have visited the countries during their tenure. Since 1997, 16 Chinese medical teams have worked in Eritrea. China is Eritrea's largest investor, contractor and also trade partner, and Chinese companies build some of the country's most important infrastructure. This work concludes an upgrade to the primary port of Massawa and also a road that links Massawa and Assab, the site of another port. If you look at other aspects, the already close relationship has governed and also grown noticeably tighter in recent years. Wang Ying, who is now China's most important diplomat, as director of the CCP Central Committee Foreign Affairs Commission, visited Asmara twice in his 3 years tenure as foreign minister. In 2020 and 2022, during the latest visit, the country established a strategic partnership, marking the first time Eritrea has entered Beijing's taxonomy of partners nations. Zhu Yingbuing, Chinese special envoy for the Horn of Africa affairs, followed up Wang's visit in March and September of the same year. During both visits, Zhu met with President Afcfta. In 2021, Eritrea officially joined the Belt and Road Initiative. Trade between the two nations has surged as well.
The imbalances globally, conflicts here and there, world wars, and continuous confrontations have been the philosophies of many minorities who have tried to dominate. It's hegemonistic. It's dominating as an attitude to suppress peoples and nations and finally control or dominate global economy. It's been a misguided policy. It's a misconception of realities. It's misunderstanding of history. Now we see the future is very bright. The future is very bright because of Chinese achievement. China has proven to everybody in the world, the marginalized and those who entertain the ideas of domination, this is no more the rule of the game. People of the world will have to cooperate. The new world order is an order of cooperation, complementarity, and working together. It's not a world order for domination or hegemony.
If you look at the strategic relationship and geopolitics playing within that region, in the last 11 years, Chinese companies have bought controlling stakes in all four of Eritrea's developing and also mining projects from Australian and also Canadian companies. Some of those projects contain world-class deposits. Two of those acquisitions, Zhenjing Mining Group's bought out of Canada's New Sums Resources and copper and zinc mine, and also Sichuan's Road and Bridge Group bought out of Australian's company Danakali's potash projects, happening within the last 5 years. If you look at this particular region, as US influence continue to wind down in those particular areas, Russia's recent engagement is shown absolutely clear. Shortly after his visit to Beijing, Afcfta jetted off to Moscow for discussions with President Vladimir Putin. Russia's ties with Eritrea are much less extensive than China, in part because Soviet Union's 1991 collapse severely curtailed Russia's African outreach. But like Afcfta's visit to China, this trip to Russia is part of a broader campaign to deepen ties. 4 months before Afcfta's Moscow trip, Sergei Lavrov made his first ever visit to Eritrea by a Russian foreign minister. Eritrea was also the only African country to vote against the 2 United Nations resolutions condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And Eritrea, along with China, Russia, and other states of gallery states within the region, founded an anti-Western group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations in 2021. Eritrea is only about the size of Virginia, with a population of around 6 million people, but Asmara punches above its weight in political and geopolitical significance because of where it is sit. It has nearly 1,400 miles of Red Sea's coastline and also shores at maritime border with Yemen and Saudi Arabia. It holds a commanding position on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a global shipping checkpoint, and its islands pepper the Red Sea's approach to the strait. Assab is closer than any other port to the heart of the Bab, and much of Eritrea may be mineral rich. If you look at other aspects, the implication to the United States of America, this is a very interesting perspective, looking at the changes and also the geopolitics in that particular part of the world. Alarm bells should be ringing in the Pentagon and State Department if China develop a base or possibly even dual infrastructure in Assab or Masava to complement its base in neighboring Djibouti. It will be able to block the Bab and Mandeb Strait. If its confrontation with China were to occur, such a closure will force America's Sixth Fleet to waste precious days staying from the Mediterranean Sea around the southern ribs of Africa to get into Indian or Pacific Ocean. Beijing could also cut off access to the port of Djibouti, which is critical for the operations of nearly a US military base, and which is used by 5 of the Departments of Defense 11th Combat Command. If you look at geopolitics in that region, Eritrea has recently begun to grant basing rights to foreign powers. The United Arab Emirates, another country rapidly deepening ties with China and also Russia, operated a military base at Assab for years as part of its Yemen operation and made improvements to the airstrips there. Several years ago, the United Arab Emirates began dismantling parts of the base. However, it is unclear whether it's fully withdrawn or still maintain a presence there, particularly as the original lease for 30 years. If you look at Russia's also presence, Russia also wants a base in the region to bolster its ability to project power into the Red Sea, with the potential to cause problems for the United States in terms of their geopolitics. In 2018, Moscow signed an agreement with Asmara to establish a logistic base, but nothing appeared to have come of it. However, Lavrov may have visited the topics in his January visit to Asmara, and there are rumors that the Wagner Group already has an unidentified presence in Eritrea. Notwithstanding the recent Moscow-Wagner split, Wagner's African operations are of such a value to Moscow that they are likely to continue in some form. Moscow also tried to secure its own base in Djibouti, but was rebuffed, and also has long pressed the Sudanese government to basing rights in Port Sudan on the Red Sea. Eritrea increases closeness with two of Washington's primary competitors come amid years of decline in America's influence in the Horn of Africa. Eritrea's eastern neighbors in Djibouti, which hosts an American military base. As of the 2017, Djibouti also hosts Chinese first overseas military base, a hardened encampment with a piers large enough to support a Chinese aircraft carrier and nuclear submarine. Also, Chinese companies have built or begun managing two of Djibouti's seaport for commercial terminals, and also have constructed much of country's recent infrastructure, which contributes to Djibouti's heavy Chinese debt load. If you look at other aspects to Djibouti's each side, Somalia, which is wrecked by conflict and also corruption, despite its billions of dollars that the United States of America and others have showered on Mogadishu for decades. Its foreign minister Abshel Omar Jama recently visited Moscow for talks with Lavrov. They reportedly discussed military cooperation, raising the spectrum of Wagner's mercenaries being stationed in Somalia, based on media report. To Eritrea's west lies Sudan, which has over 500 miles of Red Sea coastline. Civil war broke out there in April, derailing years of America's effort to help cement a civilian-led government. Meanwhile, Russia has a strong presence in the countries, primarily through Wagner. If you look at the American response with regards to the issues happening in that particular part of the world, the United States of America faces increasingly likelihood that thousands of miles of Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and the Indian Ocean coastline will become progressively more inhospitable. Two of those three countries, Eritrea and Djibouti, that command the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, could fall irretrievable into the hands of Chinese camp. Yet, Washington response as either apathic or ineffective. In Sudan, the United States of America spent most of its diplomatic energy supporting doomed ceasefire, and despite years of warning from senior U.S. military officers, Washington has failed to halt or even impose Chinese growing influence in Djibouti. Meanwhile, the United States of America has allowed one of its most promising relationships in the whole region to cool. Washington has slowed its engagement with pro-American Somaliland, with also its recent renovated Berbera seaport and also airport, over delayed elections and territorial dispute in its east. Those concerns are legitimate. However, the United States is losing out in the important parts of the world, and tightening relations with Somaliland is one of the ameliorated that problem. Eritrea's increasingly close relations with Beijing and Moscow likely mean that the situation in the Horn of Africa will soon get out or even worse with regards to Washington's approach. The warning signs are obvious, but whether Washington is paying sufficient attention or has a workable plan for addressing the problem, it is much less clear. If you look at the geopolitics in the region, as Eritrea continues to move a lot closer to Moscow and also Russia, United States of America, we're gonna be struggling with regards to its strategic operations with considering issues in Niger and the drone base in Agadez. The African continent is poised to play a very important role in the world. If you think that Africa does not have an influence in several areas, then think again. We want to thank you for watching. If you are new to our channel, we'd encourage you to check some of our informative video on this YouTube channel. We are looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Well, to talk a little bit more about this, we're now joined by South Africa's former ambassador to Eritrea, Ambassador Professor Iqbal Jazbai. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter. It's good to be back.
All right. So before we get into, the countries, Eritrea in particular, just give me a general sense. I suppose when it comes to Russia, Africa is always going to be divided depending on the history.
Indeed, most countries will vote according to their very own national as well as geopolitical interests. As you mentioned, many countries on the continent at the moment have very strong military as well as economic ties with Russia. So you see in the context of the vote which Eritrea chose to undertake, it took into account its own geopolitical interests as well as its historic national interest in making that particular discussion, Peter.
All right. Well, let's talk then about Eritrea. Most African countries chose to abstain, and I guess what it says when you abstain is we're not going to vote against you, but we can't go all out and endorse your invasion. I suppose that's how we translate it. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes, it is a correct assumption, and it comes back to the point as to what is the state of bilateral relations between that particular state, its foreign policy, and its particular immediate interest. For example, in the case of Eritrea, the historic relationship between Russia and Eritrea has not been a very healthy one. We recall that Eritrea fought, according to many scholars, the longest anti-colonial battles. First, there were the Italians there for some 52 years. Then came the British for some 11 years. And then started this war against a own continental neighbor, and that's in the form of its second most populated country in Africa, where the Eritreans had to fight the Ethiopian state at that point under Haile Selassie and the government of Mengistu. So during that context, the Russians in the Cold War era were supplying arms to the then Ethiopian government. So the historic relationship has not been very good, but more recently, since particularly 2011 onwards, when the Eritrean government and its policymakers undertook an assessment, they came to the conclusion that it's better to now work with the Russians more closely, given this particular history. So they've exchanged ambassadors, they've started a few economic projects, and also the fact that historically the Eritrean military had Russian aircraft, and many of those Russian aircraft, given the Ukrainian air technicians are very familiar with it, were brought to Eritrea to service those MiG aircraft, and that gives us some sense of the political complexity in the past. But currently, the US has decided to unilaterally impose economic sanctions on Eritrea. So when the Eritrean policymakers had to assess the balance of political, military, and regional geopolitical balance of forces, they opted to vote against the US and in favor of Russia because they believe that will secure their interests and it will be more in line with the AU and according to the Eritrean government and the non-aligned movement principles of not having single country resolutions against any country, the principle of avoiding double standards in human rights, and so forth. So those are some of the broad framing of the Eritrean response to exactly why they voted on this resolution against the resolution and in favor of Russia.
It is interesting because to vote no is quite a definite statement. It goes beyond abstaining. Eritrea, as you help me understand, it's been described as the Cuba of Africa. Cuba itself, also under US sanctions, could not bring itself to vote no. They too abstained, but one knows the relationship that it has with Russia. So Eritrea went a step further. So was this a vote for Russia or a vote against the US or a bit of both?
I would see it on two fronts. The Cubans are very close to the US, just a few kilometers away from Cuba, and there are a number of complexities, including the fact that the US in the state of Florida, the city of Miami, hosts a huge Cuban diaspora population. And whereas in the case of Eritrea, it has had a long history with the US in the sense that when it formally got independence after the referendum in 1993, they had very healthy relations with the US. In fact, the then US ambassador had direct access to the Eritrean president, Isaias Afwerki. But the relationship started taking a huge nosedive when the US was a signatory for the Ethiopia-Eritrea border well-known Algiers peace agreement, which South Africa as well is a signatory to that agreement. The US took this decision not to implement the Algiers peace agreement. So from then on, the Eritrean government decided not to accredit an appointed US ambassador to Eritrea, but to keep the relationships at the level of charge d'affaires. During the time of Obama, there were a number of national security advisors which favored a closer relationship with Ethiopia at that point because they viewed Ethiopia as a strategic partner on what was then known as the War on Terror. And so then the relationship with the US soured further. During the Trump period, interestingly, there was some reconnecting of diplomatic relationships. Trump's State Department received the foreign minister of Eritrea. But once again, when the Democratic Party came back into power, the same national security advisors who were in office during the Obama period started implementing the same approach they had implemented during the Obama period. So my sense is that Cuba had to assess it's a very close call for them to vote in favor of Russia, so they chose to abstain, like South Africa. And Eritrea felt that it could send a very clear message to the US that it doesn't agree with these unilateral US Treasury and trade sanctions, once again, on both Eritrea and Ethiopia. So I think those are some of the factors which have to be considered as to why Cuba and Eritrea took two very different positions, in spite of the fact that they have very cordial and warm relations with Russia.